I successfully passed both the New Zealand SAS and Australian SAS selection courses on the first attempt. So which one was harder? Let's check it out. Hey everyone, welcome back to SAS Selection and Beyond. I'm Joe Hortai, and today's video is something I get asked about a fair bit, and that is, which SAS selection course is harder, New Zealand or Australia? I've had the privilege to go through both, so I thought I'd make a video to break it down and share my thoughts and perspectives with you about both of them. By the end of this video, you'll know the following, at least from my perspective. 1. Which SAS selection I found harder and why? 2. What I would do differently if I had to prepare for selection again. 3. What I recommend you do if you're considering applying for either of these courses. So let's get into it. I was young and inexperienced. When I first applied for the NZSAS selection, I was just 20 years old. I'd been in the Army for about a year and a half total, which included a 12-week basic training, followed by a 14-week infantry corps training course. So when I walked into that selection, I was still young and raw, not just as a soldier, but as a person with very little life experience. Before joining the Army, the hardest thing I'd done was labouring work out in the fields for leader brand produce, weeding huge paddocks, picking squash and broccoli out in those same fields, and packing crates for export. I thought that was tough at the time, and it was for a young teenager like me, but nothing compared to the grind of SAS selection. I wasn't as prepared as I possibly could have been for the extreme physical and mental stress that I'd face. Although I was young and nervous, I was excited and eager. I was driven, my mind was already made up, despite people advising me to spend more time in the infantry battalion to gain more experience. Even though they said that, recommended it, I didn't bother listening. I was focused on my goal of joining the SAS. I had my own path, and I believed in my ability to push through whatever was going to be thrown my way. When I look back on it, the NZSAS selection was without a doubt the hardest thing I'd ever done in my life. Until that point, I went into selection feeling fit and like I'd prepared well. I was fairly lean, 110 kgs, about 240 pounds, but a lean version. By the end of the course, I was drained, weak and limping. I dropped down to about 78 kilos, about 171 pounds. My body was wrecked, my feet were swollen, and I was physically depleted. I found energy and strength only through having successfully completed and passing the selection course itself. The selection was brutal, and it stripped back a young, reasonably fit 20-year-old, at the time at least anyway, and turned me into what I imagined a very old man must feel like. But here's the thing. Despite how hard it was, I knew that I was walking in the footsteps of those who had been through this, and therefore I knew that this could be done. I felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment when I did actually finish. From memory, we started with about 42 candidates on my selection anyway, and roughly 12 of us made it through. Apologies if there was more than that, which is and was a very high completion rate. Pretty sure it was about 12. I'll never forget that feeling of successfully passing and being accepted to progress onto the cycle of training. I think one of the things that hit me hard was my mum. I'm not sure she remembers this, but she cried when she saw me after selection, probably because of how feeble and weak I looked. With tears in her eyes, she couldn't understand why I would want to go through something like that. But I think that's just mums for you. I went into it as a young, inexperienced soldier, and the experience helped to shape my thoughts, my abilities, and my beliefs about what was possible. I was pushed to what I thought were my limits during selection, but during the process I discovered that I always had more to give. I was still breathing, and I was still able to move, albeit slowly as the selection progressed. So in my mind, I knew I just had to keep going. And as a result, I was fortunate to come away as a stronger and more resilient person. Now, fast forward to my time on the Australian SASR selection, or Carter course as it used to be called. Because I had already successfully passed NZ selection, I felt and still believe to this day that I had a distinct advantage going into the selection course. Let me clarify for you though, I never saw it as a guarantee that I would pass the Australian selection just because I passed the New Zealand one. In fact, I felt a considerable amount of weight and pressure and responsibility on my shoulders. I did feel as though I had an advantage though, because I knew the level of suffering that was going to be required, and I knew that I was capable of enduring the struggle. My mindset was already set. I was going to push through no matter how bad things got. Before the Australian selection, there was a 3-day barrier test. I think they call it a Special Forces Entry Test these days, or SFET for short. I'll be honest, by the end of the barrier test, I was in bad shape. The Australian heat got to me, and I wasn't as prepared as I should have been prior to going on it. My body cramped up during the test, and I really struggled. I ended up limping over the finish line, having done just enough to earn a spot on the next selection course. But I learned from that experience, and thankfully I didn't make those mistakes again. Also, thankfully, the actual selection course started a few weeks later, and by then I was good to go. I came back stronger, and I prepared well by the time the actual selection course started. In the end, I passed the Australian SAS selection, and I was able to use the lessons I learned from the New Zealand selection to keep my mind and body in check throughout the process. For context, the NZ selection at the time involved a 5 to 6 day pre-selection, which rolled straight into a 9 to 10 days of the actual testing for the NZSAS. Australia, on the other hand, had a 3-day barrier test, as I mentioned. Then a few weeks later, I don't remember exactly how long, but a few weeks later, we then rolled into the SASR selection, which I was fortunate to earn a spot on after completing the 3-day barrier test. So the Australian selection course is 21 days or 3 weeks testing. But even though the Australian course itself was longer compared to the New Zealand one, I felt a certain level of confidence that I could put up with whatever came my way during the Australian course, even though it was longer. All right, so after all of that, which selection was harder, New Zealand or Australia? First, let me make it absolutely clear that both selection courses are extremely hard. I can say that with a level of authenticity because I've been privileged to complete both. That being said though, for me personally, the New Zealand SAS selection was harder for me. And here's why. Inexperience. I was young and less experienced when I did the New Zealand selection. I didn't know what to expect, and I had no real idea of how far I could push myself. Second, the physical toll, because I had never done anything as difficult as the New Zealand SAS selection up until that point. I found the physical and mental toll to be beyond anything I could have imagined. The weight loss that I had experienced as a result of the New Zealand selection just really put my body on the brink of shutting down. I had no idea how bad it was going to feel. Third was my mindset. The biggest difference when I went into the Australian selection was the experience and my mindset. Having already been through the New Zealand selection, I knew what I was capable of, and that gave me a huge mental advantage, at least I felt anyway. I already knew how much I was willing to suffer to make it through, and even then I probably didn't fully understand. But here's a disclaimer. I also believe that if I had done the Australian selection first and the New Zealand selection second, I'd be saying the Australian SAS selection was harder. Why? Well, it's pretty simple really. Because I would have had the same inexperience, the same nervousness, anxiety and excitement prior to the Australian selection as I had for the New Zealand one. The longer duration, the heat, the conditions and more, these would have played on my mind going into the selection, but I would have then used those experiences to fuel me for the New Zealand selection had the sequence of events been reversed. Don't get me wrong, I struggled and suffered through the Australian selection. It's bloody hard. But having gone through the New Zealand selection first, I was able to draw on that for strength throughout the Australian selection course. That being said, here are the 3 things I said you would receive or take away from this video. First, which selection is harder? For me, the New Zealand SAS selection was harder because of the reasons I've already mentioned, so I'm not going to delve into that anymore. Second, what I would do differently if I had to prepare again. This is always a tricky question because there's no guarantee that changing anything would result in a better outcome for me or that I would pass. I achieved the result that I wanted. So if I changed anything, not that I can or could anyway, but if I did, I might end up failing. So for me personally, I wouldn't change a thing. And third, what I recommend if you're considering applying for SA selection. be honest with yourself, really honest with yourself. If you really want to serve in the unit, you'll put up with whatever's thrown at you. Second, if you're coming in young, inexperienced, nervous, scared, but excited, that's awesome. Embrace that energy and embrace those emotions. They'll help you to keep you humble and engaged throughout the process. Third, just know and understand that it will be tough and you don't really have any idea just how hard until you're in it. But that's the best place and best way to learn. Fourth, yes, make sure you put in the physical work to prepare, but make sure you also turn up with the right mindset and attitude before you arrive, and you'll give yourself the best chance. 5, don't listen to the naysayers, even if they've attempted selection before, and especially don't listen to those naysayers who have never even tried or attempted selection. Trust in your abilities and your goals, apply your systems to achieve them, and block out the noise. So that's it. Thanks for watching. I hope this video helps clarify which SA selection is harder. If you didn't click on, they're both bloody hard. Let me know your thoughts and any questions in the comments below. And if you'd like to support this channel's growth as I start again from scratch after a 2-year hiatus, I invite you to hit the subscribe and like button before you go somewhere else. For your information, in closing, I'll be uploading a bunch of content covering different topics that I either get asked about, have experienced, or feel might be helpful to the viewers. If you'd like to get an idea of what that content or what the content is that you can expect from this channel and from myself, feel free to have a read of the channel description. Thanks again for your time, and I'll catch you in the next video.